Okay, as you can see, I'm in my pajamas. I don't know why. I just feel like making a video like this. No, what you just saw was not from this presidential election. It was actually from a documentary of a film called Hacking Democracy. HBO put out back in 2006. Election fraud is nothing new. So I figured, since this is all in the news, I would go ahead and take my time. I feel like I've been spending way too much time on courts of law, which are incredibly important if you wish to have a functioning government. Because I'm going to go ahead and say this before I kind of give my presentation. And that is, if we can't get courts of law like in our neighborhood, in our backyard, if we can't get the people right around us in our own counties, our own law enforcement, the police that are actually on our streets, and the judges that are actually in our courthouses, if we can't get them to follow the law, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you there's absolutely no help getting the court of the legislatures and the court of the executive branches to start following law. So think about that, and that's why I spend so much time on courts of law. Not courts of justice, courts of law. So, real quick, let's watch a video that I'm going to link up here. And I did this back in May, March, sometime towards the beginning of the year. And it was talking about the Constitution and how senators used to be elected and president and vice president of the United States used to be elected. Check it out. Section 3. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof. So it's in brackets and it has a little star next to it so that you know that it was taken out of the Constitution. But right there, you didn't get to choose. You didn't get to vote when the Constitution was originally established, because you're not one of the people of the United States. You would have been one of the people of North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Georgia, any one of the 13 colonies. But you were not one of the people of the United States, because that was a capital P. If you don't know that, I'm going to link my last video right here. Article 2, it's about the President of the United States. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of government of the United States. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president. The person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the vice president. So after the first person with the greatest number of votes, which is the president, the next one would have been the vice president. And this is how the president and the vice president were chosen. And this actually works a lot better, because then you have a mixture of the parties typically. You don't just have a Republican executive branch or a Democratic executive branch. You have a mixture, because if the Republicans don't get their guy in there or their woman in there, then they at least want to get them in for the vice presidency. And of course, because it's politics, you're always negotiating, and it's harder to strike a deal to where everything is all Republican or all Democratic. And of course, when they had this going on and the Constitution was first written, there were multiple political parties, not just Democrat and Republican. Right. And that's real important with all the other stuff that I'm going to talk with you about. So I get these from constitutions right after the Revolutionary War. Well, because I just like to know how they used to do it. Because what they used to do worked really well. And for some reason, it doesn't work anymore. And that's because we're not doing what they used to do. Alright, Delaware, 1776, Article 7. A president or chief magistrate shall be chosen by joint ballot of both houses to be taken in the House of Assembly. So the president and the vice president, the governor and the lieutenant governor as we'd call it today, were voted on by the General Assembly of the state. Georgia, 1777. Article 9. All white male inhabitants, the age 21 years, and possessed in his own right of 10 pounds value, and liable to pay tax in the state. And this is what it's talking about, the qualifications for people to have the right of suffrage or to be able to vote. And I know that a lot of people will probably focus on white male, so I'm going to read a different one to you. What I focus on is the 10 pounds of value, liable to pay taxes. Maryland, 1776. That all persons invested with the legislative or executive powers of government are the trustees of the public and as such accountable for their conduct. Guess what? No qualified immunity. You are a trustee of us. Article 5. Every man having property in a common interest with and an attachment to the community ought to have the right of suffrage. Okay, if you own property, if you have business, if you have some type of investment in this community, you should have the right of suffrage. New Hampshire, 1776. That all public officers for the said colony and each county for the current year be appointed by the council and assembly, except the several clerks of the executive courts, who shall be appointed by the justices of the respective courts. Alright, the only reason I brought this up is to kind of show that even back then, what they were talking about state courts, legislated courts, were executive branch courts, otherwise known as administrative courts. That's what I talk about when I talk about administrative courts. A court of law is different than an executive court. If the legislature writes some sort of statute giving the judicial branch some type of jurisdiction or authority, then that is administrative. Period. Point blank. Done. That's the only reason I brought that up in here. Now you know. If you don't know, now you know. New Jersey, 1776, Article 4. Now this is my absolute favorite for all you liberals who are like, well, blacks didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have the right to vote. New Jersey, Constitution, 1776. That all inhabitants of this colony of full age who are worth 50 pounds proclamation money, clear estate in the same, and have resided within the county in which they claim a vote for 12 months immediately preceding the election, shall be entitled to vote for representatives in council and assembly, and also for all other public officers that shall be elected by the people of the county at large. It didn't matter if you were white, didn't matter if you were black, didn't matter if you were a woman, didn't matter if you were a man. All you had to do was have 50 pounds worth of value. Now, because I haven't quite talked about this yet, when they're saying 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 50 pounds of value, what they mean is 50 pounds of value in silver. New York, 1777. Every male inhabitant of full age be entitled to vote. He shall have been a freeholder possessing a freehold of the value of 20 pounds, or have rented a tenement therein of the yearly value of 40 shillings, and been rated and actually paid taxes to the state. Okay? So even if you didn't have the property, if you rented a place that cost 40 shillings a year, and you paid taxes, which means you had a business, you had something that was generating revenue that they could tax, you had the right to vote. South Carolina, Article 3. Senate and House of Representatives, and at the first meeting of the Senate and House of Representatives thereafter, to be elected by virtue of this Constitution, they shall jointly in the House of Representatives choose by ballot from amongst themselves governor, commander-in-chief, lieutenant governor, both to continue for 2 years. Now, why was that all important? Why did I read that? Why did I read any of it? Because I'm sitting here trying to teach people how the government's actually supposed to work, because the government we have right now doesn't work. And you have to understand and know these things in order to know how the government works. And let me explain it to you this way. You know, the other day when I called the news agency and wished to report news, and then I said, hey, I'd like to know how Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham and whoever that other dude's name was, I'd like to know how they feel about Alex Acosta breaking and violating the statutes that they put into place for us to be, protected, quote unquote, even though they just made poor judgment not talking with the victims. This is the legislative branch's job. Even today, over in England, you can't vote on the Prime Minister. That's not a popular vote. The only thing that the people can vote on is the members of Parliament. They can't even vote on the people who are in the House of Lords. And the reason why it worked that way when we developed the United States, and was actually a pretty good way for it to work, and that is because the people who work in the legislative branch have to work with the governor all the time. All the time. And that's why typically the governor would be replaced. The governors wouldn't spend a real long time in office. Unless they kept everybody happy and did a good job. And because the governor was liable to the state representatives, and the state representatives came up for election pretty often, at least once every 2 years, and the people could vote them out of office, they knew what their job was. Like, even today, Greg Newman could be impeached by the state legislature for what he did, even though I think a grand jury is a much better option because what he did was so criminal. But the state legislature could impeach him. And the reason why they don't is because they say, well, y'all can vote him out of office. And that's exactly what Josh Stein said in his letters. You see, when you spread out all the authority on voting, now you're voting for the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, they say, well, you can just vote them out of office. And if you go and try and hold their feet to the fire on what their job is, here's what they do. They say, oh, it's not my job, it's their job. Oh, it's not my job, it's their job. Oh, it's not my job, it's their job. Why do you think when we wrote Josh Stein, we wrote every single branch of government? We explained what their job was and asked them to perform. They're not going to perform. They're not going to perform. We have to radically change what's going on and how this government works. Otherwise, we're not going to have any rights. And the whole point that I was bringing up about people having 50 pounds, 10 pounds, 5 pounds, people actually having value and stake, and having to pay taxes to vote. See, that's because those people were participating in their government, and they were participating willfully. They were volunteering. They wanted to participate. They paid money to make sure that they could vote. And they did that because they had a stake in what the government was going to do. Because it would affect their business one way or another. Because what government is there to do is to regulate commerce. It's the whole point of its existence. And the only people who had that kind of money taught themselves. They were educated. And they were educated because they wanted to be educated. So they made good decisions. They voted on good people. Just think if today you had to have $5,000 in your bank account to be able to go vote, because that would have been about the lowest amount back then. And it would have to be steady. Most people, there are studies today showing that a lot of people couldn't even weather $1,000 emergency expense. $1,000. All of those people wouldn't be able to vote. And I'm not saying that that's actually how we go back and do it. What I'm saying is that when you start allowing people who don't have anything, who don't have any interest in the system, whose only interest in the system is what they can get out of the system, then they tend to vote for whoever's going to give them the most free stuff. Socrates learned this way back in the day. Check it out. I am Just Conspiracy. Thank you for joining me in my pajamas for this little session talk we had. I'd just like to conspire with other good people of this planet to leave a better world for future generations than the world we all grew up in.
We have forgotten this distinction between an intellectual democracy and a democracy by birthright. We have given the vote to all without connecting it to wisdom. And Socrates knew exactly where that would lead, to a system the Greeks feared above all, demagoguery. Ancient Athens had painful experience of demagogues. For example, the louche figure of Alcibiades, a rich, charismatic, smooth-talking, wealthy man who eroded basic freedoms and helped to push Athens to its disastrous military adventures in Sicily. Socrates knew how easily people seeking election could exploit our desire for easy answers. He asked us to imagine an election debate between two candidates, one who was like a doctor and the other who was like a sweet shop owner. The sweet shop owner would say of his rival, "Look, this person here has worked many evils on you. He hurts you, gives you bitter potions, and tells you not to eat and drink whatever you like. He'll never serve you feasts of many and varied pleasant things like I will." Socrates asks us to consider the audience's response. Do you think the doctor would be able to reply effectively? The true answer, "I cause you trouble and go against your desires in order to help you," would cause an uproar among the voters, don't you think? We have forgotten all about Socrates' salient warnings against democracy. We have preferred to think of democracy as an unambiguous good rather than as something that is only ever as effective as the education system that surrounds it. As a result, we have elected many sweet shop owners and very few doctors.